All right, so we're diving deep today into some pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah.
We've got this whole collection of information about armed conflict,
Right.
which honestly is a bit unsettling.
For sure.
The world's just never really been at peace, has it?
It really hasn't.
And it looks like small arms, like the everyday guns and grenades, play a huge role in all this violence.
A massive role.
So we're not going to get bogged down in every single detail.
Right.
But we do want to try to understand the scale of this global trade.
Absolutely.
How these weapons actually move around the world.
Yeah.
And some of the crazy connections that pop up when you look closer.
You'll be surprised.
So let's break this down and see what we can learn.
Okay.
The sources you brought are fascinating.
Thank you.
They start by going way back in time
Yeah, they do.
and paint this picture of conflict that's been going on for centuries. I mean, you've got the Crusades going on for hundreds of years,
A long time.
and then the Islamic invasions in India,
Reshaping entire regions.
even the creation of the U.S.
Ah, yes.
came out of the American Civil War, which was incredibly violent.
It was a defining moment.
And then you've got the colonization of Asia lasting for centuries.
Right.
It seems like armed struggle has always been this major force shaping the world.
Absolutely. It's a constant throughout history.
And it feels like these days, those conflicts are all kind of blending together.
Yeah, I see that too.
The sources talk about this shift
Mm-hmm.
toward more regional and global instability.
Like it's all connected now.
Exactly. And when you start listing the active conflict zones around the world, it's pretty overwhelming.
It is.
Just in the Middle East and North Africa alone,
Oh, yeah.
you've got Syria, Iraq, Libya, Egypt,
Ongoing struggles.
Mali, Sudan, Yemen, Nigeria, Cameroon.
It's a lot.
And it makes you realize how quickly local instability can spread,
It does.
especially when small arms are so easy to get.
Right, because the smaller conflicts
Yeah.
can easily escalate into regional issues.
And even global ones.
Exactly.
And that's not even the whole picture.
No, it isn't.
The sources also talk about the long-running conflicts in Afghanistan and Pakistan.
Right.
The situations in Burma, Central Asia,
Complex situation.
the Caucasus, Xinjiang, Thailand.
Still unresolved.
And then there are these new potential flashpoints popping up.
Yeah, like where?
The South China Sea, Ukraine,
Yeah.
even parts of Central America where you can't even tell the difference between rebel groups and drug cartels anymore.
The lines get blurry.
It's just constant tension and unrest.
Yeah.
And that just creates this never-ending demand for weapons.
It fuels the whole cycle.
Exactly. And that brings us to the global arms trade.
The heart of the matter.
It's a business, right?
Business.
These conflicts become profitable
Unfortunately.
for some major players, like the U.S., Britain, Russia, China.
The big ones.
They've got these massive military-industrial complexes.
Powerful networks.
These companies that make weapons and everything that goes with them.
Right.
And sometimes it seems like they benefit from all this conflict.
That's a complex issue.
And here's a statistic that really blew my mind.
Okay.
About 80% of the casualties in the global arms trade are caused by small arms.
Wow.
Think about that.
Yeah.
Not tanks or fighter jets.
Right.
It's the rifles, the pistols, the grenades
The everyday weapons.
that are doing the most damage.
It's about availability.
These are the weapons that make up the bulk of the trade.
Both legal and illegal.
The legal trade is estimated to be worth something like $5 to $7 billion every year.
That's huge.
And that includes some illegal activity.
Right.
Then you've got the completely illegal trade,
Under the radar.
which is still estimated at around $1 billion annually.
A lot of money changing hands.
It's crazy.
Yeah, and it makes sense in a way.
How so?
I mean, we hear all about these big weapon systems.
Yeah. The fancy jets and tanks,
Right, but those are often more about deterrence.
like trying to scare other countries
Exact.
from attacking.
But the small arms.
Yeah.
Those are the ones actually used in most of the fighting.
So they're the ones causing the most casualties.
Sadly, yes.
But here's where things get really interesting.
Okay, I'm listening.
The sources talk about this concept of blowback.
I've heard of that.
It's basically these unintended consequences.
Unforeseen outcomes.
I come back to bite you.
Like karma for countries.
Kind of.
Interesting.
So during the Cold War,
Yeah.
the U.S. and the Soviet Union,
The superpowers.
they were arming all these groups around the world.
Supporting their allies.
Exactly. They were giving weapons to anyone who aligned with their ideology.
A global chess game.
And now decades later,
What happens?
those same weapons are being used against the original suppliers.
Oh, wow. So it backfired.
It totally did.
That's blowback in action.
It is.
Any examples?
Yeah, like the U.S. is fighting Colombian drug lords.
Okay.
But guess who armed those cartels in the 1980s?
No way, really.
It was the U.S.
Wow.
They were trying to counter communism in the region.
Short-sighted thinking.
And it created this huge problem that they're still dealing with today.
So the enemy of my enemy is my friend situation.
Yeah. And then there's the CIA arming the Mujahideen in Afghanistan during the Soviet-Afghan War.
Right.
They flooded the region with something like 400,000 Kalashnikovs.
Wow, that's a lot of firepower.
And that had a huge impact on the region for decades.
Still causing instability today.
And then the collapse of the Soviet Union just made everything worse.
How so?
All of a sudden, you had these Eastern European countries.
Like Ukraine and Belarus.
Exactly. You had these massive stockpiles of weapons.
Left over from the Soviet era.
And their controls were a lot weaker.
So what happened?
It led to this huge surge in illegal arms transfers.
The floodgates open?
Weapons were being smuggled all over the world,
Wow.
ending up in the hands of all kinds of groups.
Terrorist organizations.
Yeah, anyone who could pay.
Dangerous situation.
And it's not just about those weapons themselves.
What do you mean?
It's the instability that creates the perfect conditions for these transfers.
So the power vacuum.
Yeah.
Left by the Soviet collapse.
Made it easy for these weapons to flow into conflict zones
And fuel more conflict.
all across the globe.
It's a ripple effect.
And nowhere is that more obvious than in Africa.
Africa has really been hit hard.
The sources paint this picture of a continent drowning in small arms,
Wow.
fueled by all these devastating
There's
conflicts.
still many conflicts.
Algeria, Sudan, Mali, Libya, Angola,
It's a long list.
Burundi, Congo, Rwanda, Somalia, Sierra Leone,
It's terrible.
and the main suppliers.
Who's sending all these weapons?
You've got Eastern Europe,
Right.
the CIS states,
Former Soviet republics?
and increasingly China.
China's a rising power.
And it's not just about internal conflicts.
What else is going on?
You've got external actors
Countries from outside Africa
trying to get involved.
for their own benefit.
Yeah, they want influence or access to resources.
For meddling.
And the influx of arms just makes everything worse.
Or worse.
It prolongs the fighting and makes it much more destructive.
For the people who live there,
Exactly.
it's tragic.
And within Africa itself,
Uh-huh.
Libya stands out as a major source of these weapons.
Even before the NATO intervention.
Yeah, Gaddafi's regime was arming groups all over the place.
Like who?
The Wet-Eye rebels in Chad,
Okay.
Muslim rebels in the Philippines,
Across the world.
rebels in Sierra Leone.
Wow.
And what's really shocking
What was that?
is that EU countries were heavily arming Libya themselves.
Really? In the years leading up to 2011? I didn't
Yeah.
know that.
And then after the intervention,
What happened?
Gaddafi's own arsenal
Their weapons they had supplied.
were transferred from Benghazi to Syrian rebels.
Oh, wow. So they just ended up somewhere else.
Exactly. It's like this unintended consequence of trying to get rid of a dictator.
Removing one problem just created another.
Yeah, it's a tough situation.
It is.
And the details about illicit arms in other African countries are just crazy.
Like what?
In Egypt, back in 2000,
Okay.
the police seized all these automatic rifles, pistols, from people who were traveling to Libya a lot.
So they're smuggling them.
And Egypt itself was a source of weapons going into Gaza.
Wow.
And then you've got Algeria, where they were finding Israeli-made weapons all over the place.
Like Uzis.
Yeah, and other ones,
And where were they coming from?
along with Belgian and Czech arms.
So all over.
It seems like Western intelligence agencies were turning a blind eye to all this.
So they knew it was happening.
It seems that way.
But they let it continue.
Maybe they had other priorities.
Who knows?
Murky.
It is.
And then there's Sierra Leone.
That was a brutal conflict.
It's the Revolutionary United Front, or RUF.
I heard of them.
They were notorious for human rights abuses.
Terrible things.
And they were getting a lot of their weapons from Libya.
Gaddafi again.
Yeah. The sources talk about air cargo shipments via Burkina Faso and Liberia
So using other countries.
as transit points.
Right.
They were even doing helicopter drops into RUF territory.
Wow.
And in March 1999, there was this huge Ukrainian shipment.
What was in it?
Thousands of Kalashnikovs, machine guns, grenade launchers,
Oh.
SA-7, and Matus anti-tank missiles.
That's a lot of firepower.
All going through Burkina Faso and Liberia.
Like a network?
And a journalist in May 2000 reported on a massive arms seizure.
What did they find?
It was over 12,000 small arms
Wow.
and nearly 390,000 rounds of ammunition.
That's crazy.
mostly Ukrainian Kalashnikovs,
Okay.
Iranian G3s,
Mm-hmm.
and Belgian FN Falls.
So a mix of everything.
That just shows how interconnected this whole thing is.
You can track it from one place to another.
And then there's Sudan.
Another conflict zone.
It was between the Muslim North and the Christian South.
Right.
And it didn't get as much attention.
Under the radar.
But it was just as brutal.
So who was supplying them?
Well, there was this Slovak ammunition shipment.
Okay.
That was supposed to go to Chad.
But it didn't.
It got offloaded in Khartoum.
Sudan's capital.
And then you've got China getting involved
Really?
through their oil companies.
CNPC and MNPC.
They were supplying weapons,
Interesting.
sometimes disguised as oil exploration equipment.
Sneaky.
And then you've got Iran, South Africa, Jordan,
Okay.
Yemen, Qatar,
All involved.
even larger weapons sales from Iraq, France, Eastern Europe.
Wow.
The UAE was shipping arms to Islamist militias using leased Russian cargo planes.
It's like everyone's getting in on the action.
And then there's Uganda supporting the SPLA.
The rebels in South Sudan.
Yeah, and the conflicts in Nigeria with Boko Haram.
Right.
And in Somalia and Ethiopia.
With al-Qaeda-linked groups and piracy.
Just a mess.
A tangled web.
And what's interesting is how the lines get blurred
Between who?
between governments and non-state actors.
Explain that.
So you've got governments directly selling weapons.
Okay, that's normal.
But then you also have private companies or even legitimate businesses
Getting involved.
being used to move these weapons illegally.
So it's hard to tell who's doing what.
Exactly.
It's shady business.
And then when we shift our focus to Europe, the end of the Cold War had a huge impact.
How so?
All these Eastern European countries
With their state-controlled arms industries.
became major sources for gray market transfers.
What's a gray market transfer?
It's basically when a deal isn't completely illegal,
Okay.
but it's not exactly transparent either.
So skirting the rules.
Yeah, there are ways to get around regulations.
Interesting.
And after the Soviet collapse,
Right.
there's all this economic uncertainty in Eastern Europe,
Makes sense.
which created opportunities for corruption.
And weapons leaking out.
Exactly.
Interesting.
And Bulgaria pops up a lot as a source
For who?
for groups like the RUF in Sierra Leone
We talked about them earlier.
and UNITA in Angola.
Okay.
They even found Bulgarian arms in Albania.
So they were spreading far and wide.
Slovak arms reportedly went to Sudan and the RUF.
Oh.
And the Czech Republic was arming the LTTE in Sri Lanka.
Co.
And what's crazy is that even the EU got caught up in this.
Really? How?
The PKK in Turkey.
A Kurdish separatist group.
Yeah, they somehow got their hands on U.S.-licensed Stinger missiles.
Those are serious weapons.
They got them through Greece.
Wow.
And then they passed some of them on to the LTTE.
So even sophisticated weapons can end up in the wrong hands.
Exactly.
And one conflict can fuel another.
Through these transfers.
It's like a chain reaction.
And then in Albania in 1997,
During the Balkan conflict.
there was this massive looting of weapons.
How much?
Over 600,000 small arms were taken.
Wow, that's a huge number.
It was basically a free-for-all.
So where did they end up?
A lot of them ended up with the KLA.
The Kosovo Liberation Army?
Yeah, but Germany, Austria, and Switzerland also became sources of smuggled arms.
Those countries had large Kosovar refugee populations.
Exactly.
So maybe they were sympathetic
And even Switzerland
with their strict gun laws.
was involved.
How?
They caught trucks disguised as aid organizations.
Trying to smuggle arms into Kosovo.
And Switzerland was also a financial center for these deals.
So the money was flowing through there.
They recovered a bunch of cash from a deal that was supposed to go to an African country.
So it's all connected.
And the crazy thing is that in Macedonia, at one point, Kalashnikovs were going for just $25 each.
That's insane.
It shows just how easy it was to get your hands on these weapons.
And that's the problem.
It creates a legacy of violence.
Even after the main conflict is over,
The weapons are still there
fueling more instability.
and making it harder to rebuild.
It's a vicious cycle.
And then when we look at Russia and the CIS states,
Okay.
you see this whole other side of the black market.
What do you mean?
It was driven by economic hardship.
in the military.
Yeah, after the Soviet collapse,
Right.
a lot of military personnel were struggling
So they turned to selling weapons.
to make ends meet.
Makes sense.
And at the same time, organized crime was on the rise.
Creating more demand for weapons.
It was a perfect storm.
And how bad was it?
In 1998, the FSB confiscated 22,000 small arms, 6,500 grenades, and 4 tons of explosives.
That's a huge haul.
And in 1999, the Interior Ministry was trying to recover over 36,000 lost or stolen weapons,
Wow.
including heavy rocket systems, mortars, assault rifles.
So a lot of heavy
It
weaponry.
was a real problem.
And where are these weapons coming from?
From within Russia itself.
So leaking out of the military
Yes.
and going who knows where.
And Chechnya is a really good example.
The conflict there.
At first, Chechen rebels were getting weapons from Armenian militia.
Okay.
They used those weapons to seize government buildings and military installations.
So they were well equipped.
But then, after Chechnya declared independence,
What happened?
the Russian army became the main supplier.
How?
They left behind tons of weapons and ammunition when they withdrew.
Wow. So the rebels just took them?
Exactly.
Right.
They estimated that somewhere between 41,000 and 57,000 small arms were left behind,
That's crazy.
including all sorts of AKs
The classic Kalashnikov.
and mountains of ammunition.
So the army inadvertently armed the rebels.
It's a crazy situation.
It is.
And similar things were happening in other former Soviet states.
Whack.
Kazakhstan, for example.
Okay.
In 1999, they seized over 1,000 weapons that had been stolen from military depots.
So it wasn't just Russia.
And then you've got the South Caucasus,
Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan.
with all their ethnic conflicts and organized crime,
Evolved whole region.
and a growing gun culture.
So everyone wants weapons.
And where are they getting them?
Where are they coming from?
Former Soviet arsenals.
Makes sense.
Azerbaijan was even getting weapons from Turkey, Bosnia, Afghanistan, Pakistan.
So a mix of
A
sources
dangerous mix.
of weapons and tension.
And then you've got the Asia-Pacific region.
Okay.
It's full of conflicts and insurgency.
And everyone's armed.
And what's crazy is that a lot of the time the opposing sides
Mm-hmm.
are getting their weapons from the same sources.
Really?
The Afghan pipeline is still a big factor.
That flow of weapons from the Soviet-Afghan war.
Exactly.
Wow.
But there are other sources too.
Yeah.
Southeast Asian countries like Thailand, Cambodia, Myanmar,
Okay.
China, and some CIS states.
So a wide range of suppliers.
And then you've got highly armed societies like the Philippines.
adding to the problem.
It's like a domino effect.
One conflict feeding another.
And Afghanistan is still a major source.
Even after all these years.
It all goes back to the 1980s.
When the CIA was pouring money in.
Something like $2 billion in aid.
Wow.
It was funneled through Pakistan.
Okay.
But a lot of it never reached the intended recipients.
So where did it go?
It ended up on the black market.
Fueling the arms trade.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it turned Pakistan into a major source for weapons in South Asia.
And they were supplying who?
Insurgent groups.
Okay.
Tribal groups in Baluchistan were selling weapons just for the money.
It's a business opportunity.
You could find all sorts of weapons in Pakistan.
Like what?
M16s, Uzis, all kinds of Kalashnikovs.
A real mix.
And they were sending weapons to rebel groups in Indian Punjab and Kashmir.
The disputed territories.
Exactly.
And who else?
Terrorist groups in Northeast India.
That too.
Groups like ULFA and SCN, NDFB.
Okay.
And the pipelines ran through Southeast Asia.
Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore.
ULFA had connections with the LTTE.
The Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka.
Kashmiri rebels. The Kachins in Myanmar.
Wow.
Even remnants of the Khmer Rouge.
So they were well connected.
And then there's Myanmar.
What about them?
They're a major supplier,
Really?
especially to the LTTE and Northeast Indian rebels.
I wouldn't have guessed that.
It's surprising because they're not very developed economically.
But they still have a domestic arms industry.
And they get supplies from China.
So they're a key player.
And Bangladesh is a major transit point
For weapons going where?
to Northeast India and the LTT.
So it's all about location.
They're right in the middle of everything.
Makes sense.
And then Sri Lanka,
That was a long and brutal conflict.
it was the LTTE.
The Tamil Tigers.
They were fighting for an independent Tamil state,
right.
and they were funded by the Tamil diaspora.
Tamils living abroad.
And they were also involved in drug trafficking.
Heroin.
They were buying weapons from dealers all over the place.
Like where?
Lebanon, Cyprus, Singapore, Malaysia, Hong Kong.
So a global network.
And initially, India was supporting them covertly.
Really?
It's alleged that it continued until 1991.
Wow.
But then the LTTE turned to Ukraine in the mid-1990s
After the Soviet collapse.
for weapons and explosives.
Oh, okay.
And they were getting mortar rounds, surface-to-air missiles, machine gun ammunition from Bulgaria and the Czech Republic.
So a mix of Soviet and Eastern European weaponry.
Vietnam supplied North Korean Igla missiles.
Wow.
And there were even alleged shipments from African countries.
Ooh, like where?
Nigeria, Zimbabwe, South Africa.
So they were tapping into multiple sources.
They're getting weapons through the Afghan pipeline
Of course.
in Pakistan.
Okay.
And get this.
What?
They got 11 Stinger missiles from the PKK in Turkey.
The same ones that got them from Greece.
The very same.
Wow.
But the most ironic part
Is it?
is that the Sri Lankan government itself
Really?
allegedly provided thousands of arms to the LTTE in 1989.
Why would they do that?
Fight against the Indian peacekeeping force.
So they armed their enemy to fight another enemy.
It's a crazy situation.
Alliances can shift so quickly in these conflicts.
And what seems like a good idea at the time.
Can backfire spectacularly.
Exactly.
It's a complicated situation.
And then you've got the Philippines.
Okay.
It's like a hub for arms trafficking.
Get everything going on there.
They've got illicit production.
So they're making their own weapons.
Criminal syndicates are involved.
Of course.
And arms are flowing to all sorts of insurgencies.
Like who?
The Moro National Liberation Front, or MNLF.
Okay.
They were getting arms from Libya and Sabah, Malaysia.
So a mix of sources again.
And the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, or MILF.
Uh-huh.
They were reportedly getting support from the Middle East via Malaysia.
Interesting.
And even in Pacific Island states like Fiji and the Solomon Islands.
Those tiny islands.
Rebels were using modern assault rifles.
Where were they getting those?
Probably looted from police armories.
So even small-scale conflicts can involve sophisticated weaponry.
Yeah, it's everywhere.
It's a global problem.
And then finally we come to the Americas.
Okay.
Argentina's black market is fueled by local production.
So they're making their own weapons?
And by weapons being diverted from corrupt military and police forces.
So internal corruption.
It's estimated that there are over 2.5 million illegally held firearms in Argentina.
That's a lot.
Expelled soldiers were forming criminal rings.
Then selling weapons.
And corrupt officials were selling confiscated arms.
So the system itself is part of the problem.
It's really messed up.
It is.
And Chile had these minor insurgent groups.
So are they using?
They had military assault weapons.
Like what?
U.S.-made M16s that had been abandoned in Vietnam.
Wow.
And Soviet-era Eastern European weapons.
So a mix of Cold War leftovers.
They were using them in bank robberies.
So it's not just about political violence.
And Paraguay is a major source of assault rifles in Latin America.
Okay.
Especially for Brazil.
Interesting.
There was this crazy case in 1998.
What happened?
10,000 Glock automatic weapons were supposed to go to Paraguay.
Okay.
But they were stolen in Brazil and sold to bank robbers.
So they never made it to their destination.
It shows how easily these shipments can be diverted.
And end up fueling different kinds of crime.
And Uruguay's black market is fed by arms smuggled from Brazil and Argentina.
Okay.
As well as by corrupt officials.
Tumult story.
And then there was this crazy Colombian smuggling operation.
Tell me about it.
It involved Peruvian army officers, Jordanian arms, Russian transport planes operating out of Peru.
Wow, sounds like a movie.
It does.
What else?
The sources also talk about these indigenous small arms producers.
In the Americas?
Yeah, in Argentina, Brazil, Canada, the U.S.
Wow, so they're making their own guns.
And then you've got soaring crime rates in countries like Brazil.
So more demand for weapons.
And economic free trade zones like the Cayman Islands and Panama.
What do they have to do with it?
They provide flags of convenience for traffickers.
So it's easy to hide the origin of the shipments.
And of course, you can't talk about the arms trade without talking about the U.S.
The biggest player.
They're a source, a supplier, and a recipient of illegal small arms.
Because of all the guns they have.
Exactly. They have a huge number of privately held firearms.
And gun control is a big issue there.
It is.
What about their role in the illegal trade?
They're the biggest source of illegal weapons for Mexico.
Wow.
And a lot of that is tied to the drug trade.
So it's a complex issue.
Even in a country with established laws.
It's hard to control.
So to kind of sum everything up,
Okay.
it seems like these smaller weapons, the small arms,
Right.
are actually fueling way more conflict than the big stuff.
The tanks and missiles.
Exactly. Those bigger systems are more about deterrence.
Scaring people.
But the small arms,
Yeah.
they're the ones being used in the actual fighting.
And causing most of the casualties.
It's like that movie Lord of War.
I've seen that one.
Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction.
It really is.
And what's fascinating is that we always hear about these big conflicts.
The ones involving major powers?
Yeah. But it's the small arms
Yeah.
that are sustaining all these smaller conflicts.
The ones we don't hear about as much.
And they're having devastating consequences.
For ordinary people.
So what does all this mean for you, the listener?
Yeah, what can we take away from all this?
It means that there's this massive global network.
For moving small arms.
And it's incredibly complex and entrenched.
To track.
And it's having unintended and often devastating consequences.
For the whole world.
We've seen the historical context.
The long history of conflict.
The regional specifics.
The different players in each region.
And the sheer volume of this trade.
And billions of dollars.
It's a pretty bleak picture.
It is.
But here's what I find really interesting.
What's that?
It's the connections
Between,
seemingly unrelated conflicts.
like,
How one conflict can create a surplus of weapons that then fuel another conflict somewhere else entirely.